What if I told you that a Native American chief had to go to court to prove he was human? Or that the Statue of Liberty was originally designed as a Muslim peasant woman for Egypt's Suez Canal? Or that the romantic Pony Express lasted exactly 18 months before being killed by the telegraph? Here's the uncomfortable truth about American history. The stories you learned in school were carefully edited versions of much stranger, more complicated realities. Every sanitized textbook chapter hides a dozen inconvenient truths that reveal how messy, hypocritical, and downright bizarre our past actually was. Tonight, we're diving into 50 forbidden facts that didn't make it into your history class. Not because they're unimportant, but because they complicate the neat narratives we prefer to tell ourselves about American exceptionalism and inevitable progress. So, grab your favorite blanket, dim the lights, and prepare to discover that the real American story is far more interesting than the mythology we inherited. Let's begin with a story that perfectly captures how justice and absurdity intersect in American history. Standing Bear versus Crook, the chief who dared to be human. Well, here's a story your high school history teacher probably skipped right over. Nestled somewhere between the Indian Wars and whatever came next in the curriculum. In 1879, a Ponca chief named Standing Bear did something so audacious, so legally unprecedented that it should have changed everything. He sued the United States government for the right to be considered a human being. You see, Standing Bear and his tribe had been forcibly relocated from their ancestral lands in Nebraska to what is now Oklahoma. A journey that killed roughly 1/3 of his people, including his own son. When Standing Bear tried to return home to bury his son, according to Ponca tradition, he was arrested by General George Crook. The government's position was beautifully simple. Native Americans weren't people under the law, so they couldn't sue anybody for anything. Standing Bear's lawyer, John Webster, had to argue something that sounds absurd today, but was genuinely revolutionary then, that his client was in fact a human being with rights. Standing Bear himself spoke to the court, holding up his hand and saying, "That hand is not the color of yours, but if I pierce it, I shall feel pain. The blood that will flow from mine will be the same color as yours. I am a man." Judge Elmer Dundy ruled in Standing Bear's favor, establishing that a person is a person under the law. It was the first time a Native American had successfully argued for citizenship rights in federal court. The decision should have been a watershed moment, a legal precedent that protected indigenous rights for generations. Instead, it was promptly ignored by pretty much everyone who mattered. The federal government continued its policies of forced relocation and assimilation for decades, treating Dundy's ruling like an interesting legal footnote rather than binding precedent. Standing Bear had won the right to be human, but apparently that was a right the government preferred to keep theoretical. But of course, Standing Bear's case wasn't the only time someone had to fight for recognition of their basic humanity. Deborah Sampson's 18-month masquerade. Speaking of people who weren't supposed to exist according to the rules of their time, let me tell you about Deborah Sampson, who decided that if the Continental Army wouldn't let women fight, she'd just have to stop being a woman for a while. In 1782, she bound her chest, deepened her voice, and enlisted as Robert Shirtliff, a name that sounds like it was generated by someone who'd never actually met a Robert. For 18 months, Sampson served in the 4th Massachusetts Regiment, marching through the Hudson River Valley and fighting in several skirmishes against the British. She was wounded twice, once taking musket shot to the leg, which she dug out herself rather than risk discovery by a field surgeon. The sheer determination required to perform battlefield surgery on yourself with a pocket knife just to maintain a military career you weren't supposed to have is the kind of commitment that would make most people reconsider their life choices. Her secret came out the way these things usually do. Through illness rather than injury when she developed a fever during an epidemic in Philadelphia. A doctor discovered her biological identity while treating her. Instead of court-martialing her for fraud, the Army discharged her honorably and even gave her back pay, suggesting that her commanders had developed a grudging respect for someone who literally bled for the cause. After the war, Sampson did something even more remarkable. She went on a lecture tour, speaking publicly about women's capabilities and rights. This was at a time when most women weren't allowed to speak in public at all, let alone about controversial political topics. She essentially became one of America's first professional female public speakers funded by her military pension. Her story raises the uncomfortable question of how many other Roberts and Johns in military records were actually Deborahs and Marys, women whose contributions to American independence disappeared along with their assumed names. And speaking of women whose contributions were systematically erased from history, the mill girls who walked out first. In 1825, while most of America was still figuring out what this whole industrial thing meant, 800 women in Lowell, Massachusetts, decided they'd had quite enough of their working conditions. Thank you very much. These were the mill girls, young women who worked in the textile factories that were supposed to represent American progress and prosperity. When the factory owners announced wage cuts, the women did something unthinkable. They organized the first all-female labor strike in American history. The Lowell mill girls weren't your typical downtrodden factory workers. Many were daughters of New England farmers, educated women who saw factory work as temporary, a way to earn money before marriage or to help support their families. They lived in company boarding houses, attended lectures, published their own magazine, and generally considered themselves respectable members of society, which made their decision to strike even more shocking to contemporary observers. When the wage cuts were announced, the women didn't just grumble and accept their fate. They held meetings, elected leaders, and marched through the streets of Lowell singing protest songs. One of their leaders, a woman whose name was probably Harriet Hanson, but whose identity has been somewhat lost to history, gave speeches that would make modern labor organizers proud. They called their walkout turning out, as if they were simply leaving a social gathering rather than launching a labor revolution. The strike lasted several days and ultimately failed. Most of the women returned to work rather than lose their jobs entirely. But their action inspired labor movements across the country and established tactics that would be used by unions for the next century. They proved that collective action was possible even for workers who were supposed to be grateful for any employment at all. Of course, when historians later wrote about the American labor movement, they somehow managed to focus almost exclusively on male-led strikes and male union leaders, relegating the mill girls to a footnote in the women's history section, as if labor history and women's history were two completely separate things. But wage cuts and factory protests weren't the only things American leaders were worried about in the early 19th century. Madison's secret Canadian invasion fantasy. While we're on the subject of plans that didn't work out, let's talk about James Madison's not-so-secret dream of turning Canada into America's 14th state. In 1812, Madison and his war hawks in Congress weren't just thinking about fighting Britain over maritime rights and impressment. They were thinking about real estate, specifically all that lovely Canadian real estate just sitting there practically asking to be liberated. The plan was breathtakingly simple. Invade Canada, defeat the small British garrison, and wait for grateful Canadians to welcome their American liberators with open arms and freshly baked pies. Canada would become a state. America would double its territory. And Madison would go down in history as the president who completed Jefferson's continental vision. It was manifest destiny a few decades early with a distinctly northern flavor. The invasion plans were hidden in diplomatic correspondence that wouldn't be declassified for decades. But the basic strategy leaked almost immediately. American generals were already dividing up Canadian territories and discussing which cities would become American administrative centers. Thomas Jefferson himself said that conquering Canada would be a mere matter of marching, which is the kind of confident military assessment that usually precedes spectacular disasters. What followed was the War of 1812, a conflict so muddled and inconclusive that both sides claimed victory afterwards. The Americans invaded Canada 3 times and were repelled 3 times. The British invaded America and managed to burn down Washington, D.C., which was embarrassing, but not exactly decisive. The whole thing ended in a stalemate that solved none of the original problems and created several new ones. The Canadian annexation fantasy died in the swamps of the Niagara frontier, but it established a pattern of American foreign policy that would repeat itself regularly. The confident assumption that other countries would welcome American intervention, followed by the surprise discovery that they had their own ideas about governance. Speaking of American symbols that aren't quite what they seem, the Statue of Liberty's Egyptian identity crisis. Here's something that might complicate your feelings about America's most famous symbol of freedom. The Statue of Liberty wasn't originally designed for America at all. In 1865, French sculptor Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi created his colossal statue as a tribute to a Muslim peasant woman, intended to guard the entrance to Egypt's Suez Canal. The original concept was called Egypt Carrying the Light to Asia, which has a distinctly different ring to it than Liberty Enlightening the World. Bartholdi's design featured a robed female figure holding a torch meant to symbolize Egypt's role as a bridge between Africa and Asia. The Egyptian government took one look at the proposal and essentially said, "Thanks, but no thanks." They found the design too colonial, too European, and probably too expensive for a country that was already deep in debt to European creditors. Rather than let all that work go to waste, Bartholdi decided to repurpose his Egyptian peasant woman as a Roman goddess of liberty. He made some adjustments: a crown instead of Egyptian headdress, a tablet instead of Egyptian symbols, a generally more classical European appearance, and pitched it to America as a gift celebrating the centennial of independence. The transformation was so complete that most Americans have no idea their beloved symbol of freedom started life as a tribute to a Muslim woman in a completely different country. It's like finding out your family heirloom was originally someone else's garage sale purchase. Technically yours now, but with a backstory that complicates the narrative. The irony is rich enough to choke on. America's symbol of welcoming immigrants and freedom was originally designed for a colonized Muslim country, then repurposed for a country that would spend the next century and a half debating exactly who deserved to be welcomed and how much freedom they should get. And speaking of American institutions that had much shorter lives than their mythology suggests, the Pony Express's 18-month glory. If you believe the movies, the Pony Express was a romantic symbol of American frontier spirit that lasted for decades, carrying mail heroically across the dangerous wilderness while brave riders battled Indians, outlaws, and severe weather. The reality is considerably less dramatic. The Pony Express lasted exactly 18 months from April 1860 to October 1861 and was basically a failed business venture that got killed by technology. The whole operation was dreamed up by William Russell, a freight contractor who was already losing money on other transportation schemes and decided that what America really needed was mail delivery by relay horseback. Young riders would gallop between stations spaced about 10 to 15 miles apart, changing horses and sometimes riders, carrying mail pouches from Missouri to California in about 10 days. It was undeniably impressive as a logistical achievement. The riders were skilled, brave, and occasionally heroic, but it was also phenomenally expensive, charging $5 to send a letter when most people made $1 a day. The company was hemorrhaging money almost from the start, subsidized by government mail contracts that barely covered costs. Then, in October 1861, the transcontinental telegraph line was completed. Suddenly, messages that took the Pony Express 10 days could be transmitted in minutes. The Express shut down immediately, having been rendered obsolete by a technology that most people hadn't even heard of when the horse relay started. The Pony Express became legendary precisely because it failed so quickly. There wasn't time for the romance to wear off. It was like a brief, passionate affair that ended before anyone could discover the other person's annoying habits. The mythology grew because the reality was too short to disappoint anyone. But corporate failures weren't the only things being covered up in the post-Civil War era. Grant's whiskey ring and the art of political amnesia. Ulysses S. Grant had saved the Union, crushed the Confederacy, and become president on a wave of military hero worship. What he couldn't do, apparently, was notice that his closest advisors were running one of the most elaborate corruption schemes in American history. The whiskey ring scandal of 1875 involved Treasury officials, distillers, and Grant's own private secretary in a conspiracy that stole millions in federal liquor taxes. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity. Distillers would pay bribes to Treasury agents who would underreport alcohol production, allowing the distillers to avoid paying federal excise taxes. The stolen money was then funneled back to Republican politicians and used to fund Grant's re-election campaign. It was the kind of systematic corruption that would make modern political scandals look like minor ethics violations. When the scheme was finally exposed, it implicated Grant's private secretary, Orville Babcock, a man so close to the president that Grant had trusted him with everything from personal correspondence to military intelligence. The evidence against Babcock was overwhelming. Coded telegrams, witness testimony, documentary proof of bribery. Grant's response was to provide a character witness statement defending Babcock's integrity. The scandal could have destroyed Grant's presidency, but it was carefully managed and minimized by Republican leadership. Babcock was eventually forced to resign, but he was never prosecuted. The stolen money was written off as clerical errors and accounting discrepancies. The press was encouraged to focus on Grant's war record rather than his administrative failures. This became the template for handling White House corruption scandals. Minimize, deflect, and wait for public attention to move on to something else. It was America's first lesson in how political amnesia works. Scandals that seemed earth-shaking at the time become historical footnotes, especially when the people involved remain popular for other reasons. But corruption scandals weren't the only things being quietly covered up in the Gilded Age. Franklin's feathered patriotic preference. While we're discussing symbols that didn't turn out as originally planned, let's talk about Benjamin Franklin's passionate advocacy for what might have been America's most embarrassing national bird. In 1782, when the Continental Congress was designing the Great Seal of the United States, Franklin lobbied hard for the turkey instead of the bald eagle, calling the eagle a cowardly scavenger with questionable moral character. Franklin's objection to the bald eagle was both practical and philosophical. He pointed out that bald eagles primarily ate carrion and fish, occasionally stealing prey from smaller birds rather than hunting for themselves. In Franklin's view, this made them poor symbols for a republic that prized independence and honest work. The turkey, on the other hand, was a true original native of America, and though a little vain and silly, a bird of courage. The turkey argument wasn't entirely ridiculous. Turkeys are indeed braver than most people realize. Wild turkeys will fight to defend their territory and their young, while bald eagles will abandon a carcass if confronted by a determined scavenger. Franklin saw this as a metaphor for American values. Better to be a little foolish and brave than majestic but opportunistic. The elite members of Congress disagreed, preferring the eagle's classical associations with Roman power and its more impressive appearance on official seals. They wanted a symbol that would look dignified in diplomatic contexts, not a bird that was already becoming synonymous with holiday dinners. Franklin's turkey advocacy was quietly buried in committee proceedings, emerging only in private letters that wouldn't be widely published until decades later. The decision reflected the broader tension in early America between populist values and elite aspirations, between Franklin's practical republicanism and the founders' desire for classical respectability. And speaking of national policies that were quietly buried to avoid uncomfortable questions, the boarding school's solution to the Indian problem. In 1879, the same year Standing Bear won his court case, a former Union Army officer named Richard Henry Pratt opened the Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania with a mission statement that would haunt American education for generations. Kill the Indian, save the man. This wasn't hyperbole. It was official federal policy designed to systematically erase Native American culture through forced assimilation of children. The boarding school system that grew from Pratt's model eventually separated over 100,000 Native American children from their families, often for years at a time. Children as young as 5 were taken from reservations and transported hundreds of miles to institutions where they were forbidden to speak their native languages, practice their religions, or maintain any connection to their tribal identities. The schools used military discipline to enforce cultural erasure. Children who were caught speaking their native languages were beaten. Traditional clothing was replaced with European-style uniforms. Native names were replaced with Christian names, often randomly assigned from lists. The goal was to create a generation of Native Americans who were culturally indistinguishable from white Americans. The physical and psychological abuse was systematic and devastating. Children died from disease, malnutrition, and violence at rates that would have triggered investigations if they had occurred in white communities. Many of those who died were buried in unmarked graves on school grounds, their families never notified of their deaths. The boarding school system continued well into the 20th century, with some institutions operating until the 1980s. The full scope of the program wasn't publicly acknowledged until the 2020s, when ground-penetrating radar began locating the unmarked graves and forcing a national reckoning with what amounted to cultural genocide. But Native American history wasn't the only area where inconvenient facts were being systematically suppressed. The Vinland Map and the Columbus mythology machine. In 1965, Yale University announced one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in American history. A medieval map that proved Viking explorers had reached North America centuries before Christopher Columbus. The Vinland Map, as it came to be known, showed Norse settlements in what appeared to be North America, complete with Latin text describing Viking voyages to Vinland. The map's authentication process was rushed and incomplete, but its implications were too exciting to ignore. Here was documentary proof that Europeans had reached America in the medieval period, potentially rewriting the entire narrative of New World discovery. Academic conferences were organized, books were written, and the map became a centerpiece of Viking historical studies. There was just one problem. The ink was wrong. When the map was finally subjected to rigorous scientific analysis, researchers discovered that it had been created with synthetic ink that wasn't developed until the 20th century. The Vinland Map was a forgery, probably created in the 1950s by someone with a thorough knowledge of medieval cartography and a flexible relationship with historical accuracy. The forgery revelation should have been front-page news, but it was quietly buried in academic journals and specialized publications. Textbook publishers who had already invested in Columbus narratives had little interest in promoting alternative discovery stories, even legitimate ones. The map's debunking was treated as a minor scholarly correction rather than a major embarrassment. The incident revealed how invested American culture was in maintaining certain historical myths. The Columbus narrative served important cultural and political purposes. It supported European-centered views of American history and justified later patterns of exploration and conquest. Evidence that complicated this narrative, even false evidence, was perceived as threatening to established educational and cultural institutions. This pattern of protecting comfortable myths while suppressing inconvenient truths would repeat itself throughout American history, especially when it came to issues of race and gender. Women's suffrage's inconvenient intersectionality. And speaking of narratives being carefully edited to maintain comfortable myths, let's discuss how the women's suffrage movement managed to write Black women out of their own liberation story. The 1848 Seneca Falls Convention is celebrated as the birth of American feminism. But what's less discussed is how white suffragettes systematically marginalized black women's voices to maintain respectability with mainstream white audiences. Sojourner Truth's famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech delivered at the 1851 Women's Convention in Akron, Ohio was so radical and compelling that it should have become the defining moment of early feminism. Truth challenged both racial and gender assumptions simultaneously, pointing out the contradictions in a society that claimed to protect women while enslaving female human beings. But Truth's speech was edited and sanitized in later retellings. The original version, as recorded by white suffragette Frances Gage 12 years later, added a Southern dialect that Truth never used. She was from New York and spoke Dutch as her first language. This editorial choice made Truth seem less educated and more exotic, fitting white expectations of how a formerly enslaved person should sound. More importantly, Truth's intersectional analysis was gradually stripped from suffrage history. Later, suffragette leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony often argued that white women deserved the vote before black men, using explicitly racist rhetoric to advance their cause. They were willing to sacrifice black women's rights to gain white women's acceptance. The Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments borrowed heavily from the Declaration of Independence, but somehow failed to address slavery or racial equality. This wasn't an oversight. It was a strategic decision to avoid alienating potential white allies who supported women's rights, but not racial equality. The result was a women's movement that spent decades pretending that all women shared the same experiences and faced the same obstacles. Black women like Truth, Frances Willard, and Ida B. Wells Barnett were relegated to footnotes in a movement they helped create and sustain. But racial and gender exclusions weren't the only absurd conflicts brewing in 19th century America. The Pig War, when bacon nearly sparked an international incident. While American feminists were navigating complex racial politics, the U.S. and British governments were busy almost starting a war over a single dead pig. The Pig War of 1859 stands as perhaps the most ridiculous near-conflict in diplomatic history, a border dispute that escalated from livestock trespass to a military standoff. All because nobody could figure out who owned San Juan Island. The trouble began when an American settler named Lyman Cutler found a pig eating his potatoes on San Juan Island, which sits between Washington State and British Columbia. The pig belonged to a British citizen, Charles Griffin. But Cutler felt justified in shooting it since it was destroying his crops. When Griffin demanded $60 in compensation, roughly $2,000 in today's money, Cutler offered $10, pointing out that the pig was trespassing. This agricultural dispute quickly escalated because neither side could agree on which country owned the island. The Oregon Treaty of 1846 had established the border along the 49th parallel, but the language was vague about islands in the channel. Both American and British settlers lived on San Juan Island, following different laws and paying different taxes, creating a jurisdictional nightmare. When British authorities threatened to arrest Cutler, American settlers requested military protection. The U.S. sent 68 soldiers under Captain George Pickett. Yes, the same Pickett who would later lead the famous charge at Gettysburg. Britain responded by sending 3 warships with 2,000 men and 84 cannons because apparently the appropriate response to a pig incident was overwhelming naval force. For months, American and British forces faced each other across the island. Both sides loaded for bear over a livestock dispute that could have been settled in small claims court. The standoff lasted until Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany arbitrated the dispute in 1872, awarding the islands to the United States. The maps were quietly redrawn in secret diplomatic sessions, with both sides agreeing to pretend the whole incident had been a minor misunderstanding rather than a near war over pork. But pig-related international incidents weren't the only workplace conflicts getting out of hand in the industrial age. Yellow dog contracts and the corporate war on workers. Speaking of disputes that escalated beyond all reasonable proportions, let's examine how American corporations systematically crushed labor organizing through a legal fiction called yellow dog contracts. From the early 1900s through the Great Depression, employers routinely forced workers to sign agreements, promising never to join a union as a condition of employment, essentially making collective bargaining illegal through private contract. The contracts were called yellow dog agreements because critics argued that only someone with no backbone, someone yellow, would agree to such terms. But workers facing unemployment had little choice. Signing meant giving up your right to organize. Refusing meant starving. It was economic coercion dressed up as free market capitalism. Courts consistently upheld these contracts, ruling that workers voluntarily surrendered their right to organize and couldn't later claim that right had been violated. The Supreme Court's decision in Hitchman Coal Company versus Mitchell explicitly endorsed yellow dog contracts as legitimate business practices, arguing that employers had the right to hire only non-union workers. The contracts were often paired with blacklists, databases of union organizers shared between employers to ensure troublemakers couldn't find work anywhere in an industry. Workers who violated yellow dog agreements didn't just lose their current job. They became unemployable throughout their field. This system created a legal framework that made union organizing nearly impossible in many industries. Workers who tried to organize faced immediate termination and permanent blacklisting, while employers could claim they were simply enforcing voluntary contracts. It was union busting with a veneer of legal respectability. The system wasn't finally dismantled until the Norris-LaGuardia Act of 1932, which explicitly banned yellow dog contracts as violations of workers' rights. But by then, an entire generation of American workers had learned that organizing meant economic suicide. The yellow dog era has been largely erased from business school curricula and free market mythology, which prefer to remember this period as an era of unlimited opportunity rather than systematic worker suppression. And speaking of systematic erasure of economic justice promises, the 14th Amendment's missing reparations clause. While employers were perfecting the art of legal worker suppression, Congress was quietly abandoning what might have been America's most significant attempt at racial economic justice. Early drafts of the 14th Amendment included provisions for land redistribution to formerly enslaved people. 40 acres and a mule made constitutional law. These reparations clauses were systematically removed during the amendment's drafting process, erasing economic justice from Reconstruction before it could begin. The original concept came from General William Tecumseh Sherman's Special Field Order No. 15, which had temporarily redistributed confiscated Confederate land to freed slaves during the Civil War. When Andrew Johnson reversed Sherman's order, radical Republicans in Congress saw constitutional amendment as a way to make reparations permanent and legally unassailable. Thaddeus Stevens, the Pennsylvania congressman who led the radical Republican faction, explicitly argued that freed slaves deserved compensation for centuries of unpaid labor. His version of the 14th Amendment would have confiscated large Confederate estates and redistributed them to formerly enslaved families, creating a class of black landowners in the South. The economic implications were staggering. If implemented, constitutional reparations would have created black wealth accumulation that could have lasted for generations. Black families with land would have had collateral for business loans, assets to pass to their children, and economic independence that made sharecropping unnecessary. Southern Democrats and moderate Republicans killed the reparations language through parliamentary maneuvering and behind-the-scenes lobbying. They argued that land redistribution was too radical, too expensive, and too threatening to property rights. The final version of the 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection under law, but said nothing about economic equality. This editing process was largely hidden from public view. Most Americans never knew that constitutional reparations had been seriously considered, let alone abandoned. The failure to include economic provisions in Reconstruction amendments created a gap between legal equality and economic reality that persists today. The missing reparations clause represents one of the great what-if moments in American history, a path not taken that might have fundamentally altered the trajectory of racial inequality. But economic justice wasn't the only thing being undermined by corporate interests in the Gilded Age. Edison's elephant and the corporate smear campaign. Speaking of corporate interests manipulating public opinion, let's discuss Thomas Edison's most shameful PR stunt, publicly electrocuting animals to discredit his business rival, Nikola Tesla's alternating current electrical system. Edison's War of Currents campaign included demonstrations where he killed dogs, horses, and most famously an elephant named Topsy, all to convince the public that AC power was too dangerous for residential use. Edison had invested heavily in direct current, DC, electrical systems, which worked fine for short distances, but lost power over long transmission lines. Tesla's alternating current could travel much farther with less power loss, making it ideal for the electrical grids that cities needed. This presented Edison with a business problem. His technology was becoming obsolete. Rather than innovate, Edison chose character assassination. He began holding public demonstrations where animals were killed with AC electricity, arguing that any electrical system capable of killing a circus elephant was too dangerous for American homes. He coined the term Westinghoused as slang for electrocution after George Westinghouse, who had bought Tesla's AC patents. The elephant Topsy was electrocuted at Coney Island's Luna Park in 1903 after she had killed 3 men over 3 years and been deemed too dangerous to keep. Edison filmed the execution and distributed it as evidence of AC power's deadly nature. The film Electrocuting an Elephant was shown at county fairs and electrical exhibitions across the country. Edison's campaign delayed the adoption of AC power by several years, forcing Americans to rely on his inferior DC system longer than necessary. Cities had to build multiple power plants because DC couldn't transmit electricity over long distances efficiently. The delay cost millions of dollars and slowed American industrial development. Eventually, the technical superiority of AC power overcame Edison's propaganda campaign. But the incident revealed how corporate interests could manipulate scientific debates through public relations campaigns designed to confuse rather than educate consumers. Edison's reputation as America's greatest inventor conveniently omitted his willingness to kill animals for marketing purposes. And speaking of corporate manipulation of public opinion and government policy, the Banana Republic Blueprint, Hawaii Edition. While Edison was electrocuting elephants, American corporations were perfecting a different kind of power play, the corporate coup. The 1893 overthrow of Hawaii's Queen Liliuokalani wasn't a spontaneous democratic uprising. It was a carefully orchestrated corporate takeover designed to protect American sugar interests, planned and executed by the same companies that would later turn Central America into what we now call banana republics. The Hawaiian sugar industry had thrived under reciprocity treaties that allowed Hawaiian sugar to enter the U.S. market duty-free. But the McKinley Tariff of 1890 threatened this arrangement by giving subsidies to American sugar producers, making Hawaiian sugar less competitive. Rather than accept reduced profits, American planters decided to eliminate Hawaiian sovereignty entirely. The conspiracy was led by Sanford Dole. Yes, of Dole pineapple fame and other American businessmen who formed the Committee of Safety, a private organization with no legal authority but plenty of economic motivation. They claimed to represent Hawaiian democracy while planning to disenfranchise the native Hawaiian population and establish a government run by white property owners. When Queen Liliuokalani attempted to promulgate a new constitution that would restore voting rights to native Hawaiians, the committee declared her government illegitimate. U.S. Minister John Stevens immediately recognized their authority and requested Marines from the USS Boston to protect American interests. The Marines didn't fire a shot, but their presence made resistance impossible. The provisional government that replaced the monarchy was essentially a corporate board of directors masquerading as a democracy. It immediately applied for U.S. annexation, arguing that Hawaiian independence was economically unsustainable. President Grover Cleveland investigated and concluded that the overthrow was illegal, but his successor, William McKinley, completed the annexation anyway. This became the template for American corporate interventions throughout Latin America. Identify economic threats to American business interests, organize local elites, request military protection for American citizens, and establish friendly governments that prioritized corporate profits over local democracy. The term banana republic was coined to describe this pattern, but it began in Hawaii's pineapple fields. But corporate government cooperation wasn't limited to international adventures. Silent Cal's not-so-silent depression. Speaking of corporate-friendly policies with devastating consequences, let's examine how Calvin Coolidge's famous prosperity of the 1920s was built on the systematic destruction of American agriculture. Silent Cal's tax cuts and business-friendly policies created the Roaring Twenties for urban Americans. But rural America was experiencing its own depression a decade before the stock market crash. Coolidge's economic philosophy was elegantly simple. Reduce taxes on the wealthy, eliminate business regulations, and let prosperity trickle down to everyone else. His administration slashed income tax rates for high earners from 77% to 25% while maintaining high tariffs that protected American manufacturers. The result was spectacular wealth accumulation for industrialists and financiers. But farmers were excluded from this prosperity party. Agricultural prices had collapsed after World War I when European demand disappeared, leaving American farmers with massive debt and shrinking markets. Coolidge's tariff policies made the situation worse by encouraging other countries to retaliate with tariffs on American agricultural exports. Between 1920 and 1929, over 500,000 American farmers lost their land to foreclosure. Rural banks failed at 10 times the rate of urban banks. Small farming communities became ghost towns as families abandoned agriculture entirely. The crisis was so severe that farm income fell by 50% during the supposedly prosperous 20s. Coolidge's response was to lecture farmers about the virtues of free market capitalism while providing subsidies and tax breaks to manufacturing corporations. His administration actively opposed agricultural relief legislation, arguing that government intervention would create dangerous precedents for federal economic planning. The rural depression of the 20s revealed the fundamental weakness in Coolidge's economic model. Prosperity based on speculation and consumption rather than production and savings was inherently unstable. When urban prosperity finally collapsed in 1929, farmers were already experienced in economic disaster. The mythology of Coolidge prosperity conveniently omits the rural suffering that subsidized urban wealth accumulation, just as it ignores the role of easy credit and speculation in creating unsustainable economic growth. And speaking of feminist achievements that were systematically undermined by internal conflicts, Alice Paul's Equal Rights Amendment and the politics of respectability. While farmers were losing their land during the Roaring Twenties, women's rights activists were losing their momentum due to strategic disagreements that would delay gender equality for half a century. Alice Paul's Equal Rights Amendment, first introduced in 1923, passed Congress and should have revolutionized women's legal status. Instead, it became a casualty of feminist infighting that most history books prefer to ignore. Paul's ERA was elegantly simple. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. It would have eliminated all gender-based legal distinctions from voting restrictions to employment discrimination to property rights. For a generation that had just one suffrage, it seemed like the logical next step. The opposition came from an unexpected source: other feminists. Organizations like the League of Women Voters and the Women's Trade Union League opposed the ERA, arguing that it would eliminate protective labor legislation that limited women's working hours and prohibited dangerous occupations for female workers. This created a fundamental split in the women's movement between equal rights feminists and protective legislation feminists. Paul argued that protective laws were paternalistic and prevented women from competing equally in the workplace. Her opponents argued that legal equality was meaningless if women lacked the physical protection they needed to survive in industrial workplaces. The conflict became intensely personal and politically destructive. Former allies accused each other of betraying women's interests. Congressional supporters found themselves caught between competing feminist lobbies, unable to satisfy either side. The ERA passed Congress, but failed to achieve ratification by the required 38 states. The failure wasn't due to male opposition alone. It was largely due to women's organizations actively working against each other. The protective legislation feminists proved more politically effective, maintaining New Deal-era labor protections while blocking constitutional equality. This internal conflict delayed the ERA for 50 years and established a pattern of feminist political fragmentation that continues today. But feminist setbacks weren't the only progressive achievements being undermined by political manipulation. Roosevelt's court-packing scheme and the art of constitutional coercion. Speaking of political schemes that backfired spectacularly, let's examine Franklin Roosevelt's attempt to pack the Supreme Court in 1937. A power grab so audacious that it made even his allies nervous. Roosevelt had grown frustrated with the court's consistent rejection of New Deal legislation. So, he decided to solve the problem by adding more justices who would vote his way. The court had struck down key New Deal programs including the National Recovery Administration and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, arguing that federal economic regulation exceeded congressional authority. Roosevelt saw this as judicial obstructionism that threatened his entire domestic agenda. His solution was breathtakingly direct. Expand the court from 9 to 15 justices, allowing him to appoint 6 new members who would support his programs. Roosevelt's public justification was that elderly justices couldn't handle their workload effectively, requiring additional members to maintain efficiency. His Judicial Procedures Reform Bill would have allowed him to appoint 1 new justice for every sitting justice over age 70 up to a maximum of 15 total justices. The real strategy was constitutional coercion. Roosevelt was essentially threatening to destroy the court's independence unless it approved his policies. The message to existing justices was clear: start approving New Deal legislation or be outvoted by Roosevelt appointees. The plan backfired completely. Even Roosevelt's Democratic allies in Congress were horrified by the constitutional implications. Senate Judiciary Committee Democrats joined Republicans in denouncing the plan as an attack on judicial independence. Public opinion turned sharply against Roosevelt, with critics arguing that he was behaving like a dictator. Ironically, the threat worked even though the plan failed. Justice Owen Roberts began voting to uphold New Deal legislation, creating the switch in time that saved 9. The court approved Social Security, the Wagner Act, and other key programs, giving Roosevelt the victories he wanted without expanding the court. The episode revealed how even popular presidents could overreach when frustrated by constitutional constraints and how public opinion could check presidential power even during national crisis. But presidential overreach wasn't the only wartime story being kept secret from the American public. The Code Girls who won the war in secret. And speaking of wartime achievements that were systematically hidden from public view, let's discuss the 10,000 women who shortened World War II by breaking Japanese military codes. A contribution so significant that it remained classified until the 1990s to preserve the myth of male intellectual superiority in wartime intelligence work. Arlington Hall, a former women's college in Virginia, became the nerve center of American code-breaking operations against Japan. The facility employed over 10,000 people, roughly two-thirds of whom were women recruited directly from colleges and universities. These code girls worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, decrypting Japanese military communications that revealed enemy strategy, troop movements, and battle plans. The women weren't just clerical workers. They were mathematicians, linguists, and cryptanalysts who developed breakthrough techniques for understanding Japanese cipher systems. They cracked the Japanese diplomatic code called Purple, the naval code JN-25, and dozens of other encrypted communication systems that gave American forces decisive intelligence advantages. Their work directly contributed to American victories at Midway, Guadalcanal, and other Pacific battles. Military historians estimate that superior intelligence shortened the Pacific War by at least 2 years, potentially saving hundreds of thousands of American lives and eliminating the need for a costly invasion of Japan. But when the war ended, these women were sworn to secrecy and told that their contributions could never be publicly acknowledged. The official history of American code-breaking emphasized male mathematicians and military officers, relegating the code girls to unnamed support staff who processed information developed by men. The secrecy wasn't justified by ongoing national security concerns. It was designed to maintain gender stereotypes about intellectual work. Acknowledging that women had developed sophisticated mathematical and analytical techniques would have complicated post-war efforts to return them to domestic roles. The Code Girl story remained hidden until the 1990s when declassified documents finally revealed the scope of their contributions to Allied victory. Truman's Fair Deal and the Doctor's Propaganda Machine. Speaking of wartime secrets being declassified decades later, let's examine how Harry Truman's attempt at universal health care was systematically destroyed by one of the most effective propaganda campaigns in American political history. In 1949, Truman proposed national health insurance as part of his Fair Deal, a program that would have provided government-funded medical care to all Americans 60 years before the Affordable Care Act made similar headlines. Truman's plan was remarkably comprehensive. Government-paid medical care funded through payroll taxes, similar to Social Security. Every American would have been covered regardless of employment status, pre-existing conditions, or ability to pay. The proposal came directly from Truman's experience watching Americans die from treatable conditions because they couldn't afford medical care. The American Medical Association responded with what historian Monty Pone called the most expensive lobbying effort in American history up to that time. The AMA hired the public relations firm Whitaker and Baxter, pioneers of modern political consulting, to destroy Truman's proposal through a coordinated misinformation campaign. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity: label any government health program as socialized medicine, and link it to Soviet communism. AMA propaganda portrayed Truman's plan as the first step toward a totalitarian medical system that would destroy the doctor-patient relationship and turn physicians into government employees. Doctors were encouraged to display anti-socialized medicine posters in their waiting rooms and discuss the dangers of government health care with their patients. The campaign worked perfectly. By 1950, public support for national health insurance had collapsed from over 60% to less than 30%. Congressional Democrats abandoned the proposal rather than face accusations of communist sympathy during the early Cold War period. The AMA's socialized medicine rhetoric became permanent political vocabulary deployed against every subsequent healthcare reform proposal for the next 70 years. The same arguments used against Truman's plan resurfaced during debates over Medicare, the Clinton Health Plan, and the Affordable Care Act. Truman's failure established the template for healthcare politics in America. Modest reforms portrayed as radical departures, while the fundamental dysfunction of employer-based insurance remained untouchable. But medical propaganda wasn't the only area where Cold War politics was reshaping American institutions. Operation Paperclip and NASA's inconvenient Nazi heritage. And speaking of Cold War compromises that required creative historical editing, let's discuss how America's space program was built on Nazi rocket technology by scientists who had been designing weapons to kill Allied soldiers just years earlier. Operation Paperclip, one of the most morally complicated programs in American history, brought over 1,000 German scientists to the United States, whitewashing their wartime activities to gain technological advantages over the Soviet Union. The star of this recruitment effort was Wernher von Braun, whose V-2 rockets had terrorized London during World War II. Von Braun's rockets killed over 2,700 civilians in Britain and wounded another 6,000. The weapons were manufactured using slave labor from concentration camps, with an estimated 20,000 workers dying during production. More deaths than the rockets themselves caused. When American intelligence officers found von Braun in 1945, they faced an ethical dilemma: prosecute him as a war criminal or recruit him as a strategic asset. They chose recruitment, creating false biographical documents that minimized von Braun's Nazi Party membership and eliminated references to his use of slave labor. His SS membership was reclassified as nominal, and his concentration camp visits were described as technical consultations. Von Braun wasn't alone. Operation Paperclip brought chemists who had developed poison gas, aviation experts who had designed fighter planes, and medical researchers who had conducted human experiments. All received new identities and security clearances, their pasts sanitized to make them acceptable to American sensibilities. The program was initially classified to avoid public outrage, but even after declassification, the full scope of Nazi recruitment was downplayed. NASA's official histories emphasized German scientists' contributions to space exploration while minimizing their wartime activities. Von Braun became a national hero, the face of American technological achievement. This selective amnesia allowed America to claim moral superiority in the space race while relying on technology developed by war criminals. The contradiction was resolved through institutional forgetting. NASA celebrated its German scientists while ignoring their concentration camp victims. The space program's Nazi connections reveal how Cold War priorities transformed war criminals into American heroes through carefully managed public relations. But space race propaganda wasn't the only area where American foreign policy was being driven by intelligence failures. Kennedy's Bay of Pigs and the arrogance of expertise. Speaking of intelligence failures with lasting consequences, John F. Kennedy's decision to proceed with the Bay of Pigs invasion, despite explicit warnings from his own analysts, represents one of the most spectacular examples of political leaders ignoring expert advice in favor of wishful thinking. The 1961 invasion failed so completely that it strengthened Fidel Castro's regime and pushed Cuba permanently into the Soviet sphere of influence. The invasion plan was inherited from the Eisenhower administration, which had authorized the CIA to train Cuban exiles for an overthrow attempt. The strategy assumed that a small invasion force would trigger a popular uprising against Castro, creating the appearance of internal revolution rather than American intervention. It was regime change through plausible deniability. Kennedy's intelligence briefings repeatedly warned that the plan was fundamentally flawed. CIA analysts concluded that Castro retained significant popular support and that no spontaneous uprising was likely. Military assessments indicated that the invasion force was too small to succeed without direct American air support, which Kennedy refused to provide. The warnings were ignored because they contradicted what Kennedy's advisors wanted to hear. CIA Director Allen Dulles and other invasion advocates assured Kennedy that the operation would succeed quickly and quietly, eliminating a communist government 90 miles from Florida without creating an international incident. The invasion lasted 3 days. Castro's forces captured or killed nearly all 1,400 members of the Exile Brigade, while Kennedy refused to authorize the airstrikes that might have saved them. The failure was so complete that Castro used captured equipment and documents to expose American involvement, eliminating any pretense of plausible deniability. The Bay of Pigs disaster had profound consequences for Cold War politics. Castro, who had initially sought neutral relations with the United States, concluded that American invasion was inevitable and requested Soviet military protection. This led directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis, bringing the world closer to nuclear war than any event before or since. Kennedy learned the wrong lessons from the failure, authorizing increased covert operations against Cuba rather than accepting that Castro's government was there to stay. But Cold War covert operations weren't limited to failed invasions. Johnson's Daisy ad and the birth of fear-based politics. And speaking of Cold War manipulation tactics, Lyndon Johnson's 1964 Daisy ad represents the moment American political advertising discovered that voter terrorism was more effective than policy arguments. The commercial, which aired only once but changed political campaigns forever, used the fear of nuclear annihilation to destroy Barry Goldwater's presidential candidacy without ever mentioning Goldwater's name. The ad opens with a 3-year-old girl picking petals from a daisy while counting incorrectly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9. Her innocent voice is replaced by a military countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. The screen fills with a nuclear explosion followed by Johnson's voice. These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die. The ad never mentioned Goldwater, nuclear weapons, or specific policies. It relied entirely on emotional association. Goldwater had opposed the nuclear test ban treaty and made statements about using tactical nuclear weapons in Vietnam. The ad encouraged viewers to connect these positions with the image of a child being vaporized by nuclear fire. Goldwater's campaign was furious, demanding that the ad be withdrawn and denouncing it as fear-mongering. The Democratic National Committee complied, pulling the ad after a single broadcast. But the damage was done. News coverage of the controversy ensured that millions of Americans saw the commercial anyway, while discussions of the ad's appropriateness kept its message in the headlines for weeks. The strategy worked perfectly. Polling showed that voters associated Goldwater with nuclear recklessness, contributing to Johnson's landslide victory. The election demonstrated that emotional manipulation could be more effective than policy debates or traditional campaign appeals. The Daisy ad established the template for modern negative campaigning. Use fear to define your opponent's character rather than attacking their specific positions. Then benefit from free media coverage of the controversy your ad creates. But fear-based manipulation wasn't the only unconventional diplomatic tool being deployed during the Cold War. Nixon's ping-pong diplomacy and the art of soft power. Speaking of unconventional campaign strategies, Richard Nixon's 1971 decision to thaw relations with China through table tennis represents one of the most creative diplomatic initiatives in American history and one of the most successful examples of soft power politics. The ping-pong diplomacy that led to Nixon's historic visit to Beijing began with an accidental encounter between American and Chinese athletes at the World Table Tennis Championships in Japan. The breakthrough moment came when American player Glenn Cowan missed his team bus and accepted a ride on the Chinese team bus. Chinese player Zhuang Zedong gave Cowan a silkscreen portrait of the Huangshan Mountains, a gesture that was photographed and reported worldwide. The exchange of gifts between ping-pong players became a symbol of possible friendship between nations that hadn't spoken officially in 22 years. Chairman Mao saw an opportunity in the sports exchange. He invited the American ping-pong team to visit China, making them the first Americans allowed into the country since the Communist Revolution. The visit was carefully choreographed. American players were shown model factories and communes, treated to elaborate dinners, and encouraged to praise Chinese achievements for Western media. Nixon recognized the initiative's diplomatic potential. The ping-pong invitation signaled Chinese willingness to improve relations without requiring either side to make formal policy concessions. Sports provided cover for serious diplomacy. If talks failed, both sides could claim they were only discussing athletics. The ping-pong exchange broke the ice for Henry Kissinger's secret diplomatic missions and Nixon's eventual visit to Beijing. The normalization of China-U.S. relations fundamentally altered Cold War dynamics, creating a triangular diplomatic relationship that isolated the Soviet Union and gave America additional leverage in arms control negotiations. But the public focus on ping-pong obscured the larger strategic calculations involved. Nixon wasn't interested in cultural exchange. He was exploiting the Sino-Soviet split to gain advantages over both communist powers. The sports metaphor made realpolitik palatable to American audiences who might have opposed explicit alliances with communist governments. Ping-pong diplomacy proved that cultural exchanges could achieve diplomatic breakthroughs that formal negotiations couldn't, establishing soft power as a legitimate tool of international relations. But soft power wasn't the only tool being used to manage domestic political problems. The Native Citizenship Act's hollow promise. And speaking of political gestures that masked more complex realities, The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 granted voting rights to all Native Americans while simultaneously maintaining the legal infrastructure that prevented most of them from actually exercising those rights. It was citizenship as political theater, a grand gesture that changed very little about the actual relationship between tribal nations and the federal government. The act was promoted as the final step in Native American assimilation, the completion of a process that had begun with the Dawes Act's land allotment system. Supporters argued that citizenship would eliminate the special legal status that separated Native Americans from mainstream American society, making them equal participants in democratic governance. The reality was considerably more complicated. Many tribes opposed citizenship, arguing that it undermined their sovereignty and treaty relationships with the federal government. They pointed out that accepting American citizenship might be interpreted as abandoning their status as members of independent nations, potentially voiding treaty obligations and land rights. More practically, citizenship meant very little when most Native Americans lived in areas where poll taxes, literacy tests, and other discriminatory voting requirements made electoral participation impossible. Southern and Western states had perfected techniques for disenfranchising unwanted voters, and these methods worked as effectively against Native Americans as they did against African Americans. The Indian Citizenship Act created a legal paradox that persists today. Native Americans became citizens of the United States while remaining members of sovereign tribal nations. This dual status created conflicts between federal law and tribal law that courts are still trying to resolve nearly a century later. The Act's passage allowed politicians to claim they had solved the Indian problem through legal equality. While the Bureau of Indian Affairs continued policies designed to destroy tribal cultures and appropriate remaining native lands, citizenship became another tool of assimilation rather than a recognition of indigenous rights. The voting rights promised in 1924 weren't fully realized until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 eliminated the discriminatory practices that had made Native American citizenship largely meaningless. But discriminatory practices weren't limited to voting rights. Reagan's welfare queen and the politics of racial resentment. Speaking of political narratives that persist long after their factual basis has been debunked, Ronald Reagan's welfare queen mythology represents one of the most effective examples of using isolated anecdotes to justify sweeping policy changes. Reagan's 1976 presidential campaign featured stories about a Chicago woman who allegedly defrauded the welfare system for thousands of dollars, driving a Cadillac while collecting benefits. Stories that were largely fabricated, but became central to conservative welfare reform rhetoric for decades. The woman Reagan described was a composite character based loosely on Linda Taylor, a Chicago resident who was indeed prosecuted for welfare fraud. But Reagan's campaign speeches transformed Taylor's case into a mythical tale of systematic abuse that bore little resemblance to documented facts. Reagan claimed she had used dozens of fake identities to collect benefits worth $150,000 annually, an amount that was mathematically impossible given benefit levels at the time. Taylor's actual fraud was much smaller in scope. She used multiple identities to collect approximately $8,000 in fraudulent benefits over several years. Significant enough to justify prosecution, but hardly the massive scam Reagan described. More importantly, studies showed that welfare fraud rates were consistently low, typically less than 3% of all cases. Reagan's welfare queen narrative served a specific political purpose. It provided racial coding that allowed white voters to oppose anti-poverty programs without explicitly discussing race. The image of a black woman living luxuriously on government benefits while honest taxpayers struggled resonated with white audiences who were uncomfortable with direct racial appeals, but receptive to stories about undeserving welfare recipients. The mythology was so effective that it shaped welfare policy for generations. Reagan's anecdotes were cited during welfare reform debates in the 1990s. Even though comprehensive studies had repeatedly debunked claims about widespread fraud and abuse, the welfare queen became more politically powerful as fiction than Linda Taylor had ever been as reality. The case demonstrates how isolated anecdotes can be transformed into political mythology that justifies policies affecting millions of people, regardless of contradictory evidence. But mythological narratives about domestic politics weren't the only area where Reagan-era policies created lasting unintended consequences. The Iran coup boomerang, when regime change comes home. And speaking of unintended consequences from Reagan-era politics, The 1953 CIA coup that overthrew Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh represents one of the most spectacular examples of American foreign policy creating exactly the problems it was designed to solve. The operation, initially celebrated as a masterpiece of covert action, ultimately produced the anti-American theocracy that has dominated Middle Eastern politics for the past 4 decades. Mossadegh's crime was nationalizing Iran's oil industry, which had been controlled by the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company since 1909. The company paid Iran roughly 16% of oil profits while keeping the rest, an arrangement that Iranians increasingly viewed as colonial exploitation. Mossadegh's nationalization threatened to set a precedent for resource sovereignty throughout the developing world. The CIA's Operation Ajax removed Mossadegh through a carefully orchestrated campaign of propaganda, bribery, and street demonstrations that created the appearance of popular uprising against his government. The operation cost less than $1 million and took only 4 days, making it seem like a cost-effective solution to a complex geopolitical problem. The coup restored the Shah to absolute power and gave American oil companies access to Iranian resources through a consortium arrangement. For 25 years, Iran served as America's regional proxy, purchasing billions of dollars in military equipment and serving as a bulwark against Soviet expansion in the Middle East. But the Shah's regime was fundamentally unstable, dependent on secret police repression and American military support to maintain power. His modernization programs alienated traditional religious leaders while his authoritarian methods created widespread opposition among secular Democrats. The combination proved explosive when economic problems triggered popular unrest in the late 1970s. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 brought Ayatollah Khomeini to power with explicit anti-American ideology shaped by resentment over the 1953 coup. The revolutionaries portrayed America as the Great Satan responsible for 25 years of repression under the Shah, making anti-Americanism central to their political identity. The coup's success in 1953 created the enemy that American foreign policy has been fighting ever since. But Iranian complications weren't the only unintended consequences of American military policies. Clinton's don't ask, don't tell. Discrimination as compromise. Speaking of policies that created more problems than they solved, Bill Clinton's don't ask, don't tell compromise of 1993 represents one of the most spectacular examples of political triangulation, producing outcomes that satisfied nobody while institutionalizing the discrimination it was supposed to eliminate. The policy presented as progress on LGBTQ rights actually resulted in more military discharges than the explicit ban it replaced. Clinton had promised during his presidential campaign to lift the ban on gay and lesbian military service, arguing that sexual orientation was irrelevant to military effectiveness. The promise was popular with LGBTQ voters, but deeply unpopular with military leadership and conservative Democrats in Congress, creating a political crisis within weeks of Clinton's inauguration. The compromise policy seemed elegantly balanced. Military personnel wouldn't be asked about their sexual orientation, and gay and lesbian service members wouldn't volunteer the information. The ban would remain technically in place, but it wouldn't be actively enforced unless someone's sexual orientation became public knowledge. In practice, don't ask, don't tell created a system of encouraged hypocrisy that was more oppressive than the previous policy. Under the old regulations, gay and lesbian service members could serve quietly without fear of investigation unless they engaged in prohibited conduct. The new policy made the mere revelation of sexual orientation grounds for discharge, even without any misconduct. The results were devastating for LGBTQ military personnel. Between 1994 and 2011, approximately 14,000 service members were discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, far more than had been discharged in the previous decade under explicit prohibition. The policy created a climate of paranoia where service members lived in constant fear of exposure through relationships, associations, or casual comments. Military effectiveness suffered as qualified personnel were removed for irrelevant reasons. The policy was particularly destructive to critical specialties like linguistics and intelligence where cultural knowledge and language skills were essential to national security but could reveal sexual orientation through personal relationships or cultural competency. Don't ask, don't tell demonstrated how political compromise could institutionalize discrimination while claiming to represent progress. But military discrimination policies weren't the only area where environmental and health consequences were being systematically hidden from public view. The Lost Gulf War, oil fires, and environmental cover-up. And speaking of policies where unintended consequences were systematically hidden from public view, the environmental devastation from Saddam Hussein's oil well fires during the 1991 Gulf War represents one of the most significant ecological disasters in modern history, one that was deliberately minimized by both American and international authorities to avoid complicating the war's political narrative. As coalition forces advanced on Kuwait City, Iraqi troops ignited over 600 oil wells, creating fires that burned for 10 months and released approximately 6 million barrels of oil into the atmosphere daily. The smoke plumes were visible from space, creating artificial nighttime across the entire region and depositing toxic pollutants across thousands of square miles. NASA satellite data showed that the fires were releasing massive quantities of sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, and toxic hydrocarbons into the atmosphere, pollutants that would normally trigger international environmental emergency protocols. The smoke contained carcinogenic compounds at concentrations thousands of times higher than safe exposure levels, creating public health risks that extended far beyond the immediate war zone. Environmental scientists warned that the fires could cause regional climate disruption, acid rain, and long-term agricultural damage across the Middle East and Central Asia. Some climate modelers predicted that the smoke could trigger cooling effects similar to nuclear winter, though on a smaller scale than global nuclear exchange. These warnings were systematically suppressed by both the Bush administration and international organizations that wanted to maintain focus on military victory rather than environmental consequences. NASA was directed to minimize public discussion of satellite observations while environmental monitoring data was classified to prevent media coverage that might undermine public support for the war. The suppression of environmental data during the Gulf War established precedents for climate denial that continue to influence environmental policy today. The incident demonstrated how national security concerns could override environmental protection, even when the environmental consequences threatened regional stability more than military action. The oil fires revealed the inadequacy of international environmental law in addressing ecological warfare, while the cover-up showed how environmental disasters could be minimized through information control. Bush's No Child Left Behind and the art of educational data manipulation. But environmental cover-ups weren't the only area where government policies created unintended consequences that were systematically hidden from public view. George W. Bush's No Child Left Behind Act of 2002 represents one of the most spectacular examples of how well-intentioned education reform can create perverse incentives that undermine the very goals it was designed to achieve. Incentives that produced widespread cheating scandals that weren't fully exposed until a decade after implementation. The law required all public schools to achieve adequate yearly progress toward universal student proficiency, with severe consequences for schools that failed to meet numerical targets. Schools that didn't show consistent improvement faced federal sanctions, including loss of funding, administrative takeover, or closure. The system was designed to create accountability and eliminate achievement gaps through data-driven performance management. The problem was that the law created powerful incentives to manipulate test scores rather than improve actual education. Schools discovered that gaming the system was easier than genuinely improving student learning, leading to widespread cheating that compromised the integrity of educational assessment nationwide. The most notorious scandal emerged in Atlanta in 2011, where investigators found that teachers and administrators had systematically altered student test scores for nearly a decade. Over 178 educators were implicated in changing answers, coaching students during tests, and falsifying documents to meet federal targets. The Atlanta investigation revealed that similar cheating had occurred in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Detroit, and dozens of other districts. Teachers faced impossible pressure to show improvement regardless of student preparation levels, leading many to conclude that cheating was necessary to protect their jobs and their schools from federal sanctions. The scandal exposed fundamental flaws in the law's design. Measuring school success through standardized test scores created incentives for score inflation rather than educational improvement. Districts learned to focus resources on test preparation rather than comprehensive education, while educators discovered that data manipulation was more reliable than actual teaching for meeting federal requirements. The cheating scandals revealed how performance-based accountability could corrupt the institutions it was supposed to improve, turning educators into statistical manipulators rather than teachers. And speaking of federal operations that created more problems than they solved, Obama's Fast and Furious and the gun-walking disaster. Speaking of federal programs that backfired catastrophically, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, Operation Fast and Furious represents one of the most spectacularly misguided law enforcement strategies in recent history. The 2010 operation designed to track illegal gun trafficking to Mexican cartels instead resulted in the death of a U.S. Border Patrol agent and the loss of over 2,000 weapons that continue to turn up at crime scenes throughout North America. The strategy, known as gun walking, involved allowing suspected straw purchasers to buy firearms and transport them to Mexico without interdiction, hoping to trace the weapons to cartel leadership. ATF agents were instructed to observe illegal gun sales without making arrests, creating a paper trail that would supposedly lead to major cartel prosecutions. The operation was premised on the assumption that Mexican authorities would cooperate in tracking the weapons once they crossed the border. This assumption proved fatally flawed. Mexican law enforcement lacked the resources and technology to monitor weapons that American agents couldn't track effectively within their own jurisdiction. ATF agents in Phoenix warned their supervisors that the strategy was dangerous and unworkable, pointing out that they had no way to monitor weapons once they left surveillance range. These warnings were ignored by Washington officials who were convinced that gunwalking would produce high-profile arrests that would justify the risks involved. The operation's failure became public in December 2010 when Border Patrol agent Brian Terry was killed during a firefight with drug smugglers using rifles that had been purchased under ATF supervision. The weapons had been allowed to walk into Mexico months earlier, then returned to the United States in the hands of the criminals the operation was supposed to apprehend. Subsequent investigations revealed that Fast and Furious had achieved none of its stated objectives while creating massive public safety risks. No major cartel leaders were arrested, no trafficking networks were dismantled, and hundreds of weapons remain unaccounted for. The operation became a symbol of federal law enforcement overreach and poor planning. The scandal was eventually buried in partisan political debates over gun control, while the fundamental problems with gun-walking strategies remained unaddressed. But law enforcement failures weren't the only stories being systematically hidden from public discourse. The hidden women's strike for equality. And speaking of stories that were systematically buried in political discourse, the Women's Strike for Equality of 1970 represents one of the largest political demonstrations in American history. A coordinated action involving over 50,000 women in 90 cities that somehow disappeared from most historical accounts of the civil rights era. The strike was organized to commemorate the 50th anniversary of women's suffrage and demand action on three specific issues: equal employment opportunities, free child care for working mothers, and unrestricted access to contraception and abortion. It was timed for August 26, 1970, exactly 50 years after the 19th Amendment was ratified. Betty Friedan, who had founded the National Organization for Women 4 years earlier, conceived the strike as a way to demonstrate that the women's movement represented mainstream American women rather than a radical fringe. The goal was to show that women could organize effectively for political change while maintaining their roles as workers, mothers, and community members. The response exceeded all expectations. In New York City alone, over 20,000 women marched down Fifth Avenue, temporarily shutting down major traffic arteries during rush hour. Similar demonstrations occurred in Boston, Chicago, Detroit, San Francisco, and dozens of smaller cities, making it one of the largest coordinated protests of the decade. The strike demonstrated the breadth of support for women's rights issues among mainstream Americans. Participants included housewives, professional women, students, and retirees who had never previously engaged in political activism. Many brought their children to the demonstrations, emphasizing that women's liberation was a family issue rather than an attack on traditional values. Corporate America responded to the strike with a systematic backlash designed to discredit the women's movement and prevent future organizing. Major employers began implementing policies that made it more difficult for women to advance in professional careers, while conservative organizations launched propaganda campaigns portraying feminists as anti-family radicals. The corporate response was so effective that most Americans today have never heard of the women's strike for equality. Despite its size and impact on subsequent legislation, including Title IX and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, the strike's erasure from popular memory demonstrates how powerful interests can minimize political movements that threaten established hierarchies. But corporate influence on political memory wasn't limited to domestic movements. Eisenhower's military-industrial warning and the machine that ignored it. Speaking of political movements being systematically undermined by powerful interests, Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address warning about the military-industrial complex represents one of the most prescient political speeches in American history and one of the most thoroughly ignored. The January 17, 1961 speech identified the exact forces that would drive American foreign policy for the next 60 years. Yet the warning was promptly disregarded by every subsequent administration. Eisenhower's concern was specific and practical. The permanent military establishment created during World War II and the Korean War had developed economic and political interests that favored continued military spending regardless of actual security needs. Defense contractors, military personnel, and congressional representatives from districts with military facilities had created what he called a conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry. The speech wasn't abstract political theory. It was a strategic warning from the Supreme Commander, who had led Allied forces in Europe and served 8 years as president. Eisenhower had witnessed how military procurement decisions were increasingly driven by contractor lobbying and congressional politics rather than strategic necessity. His warning proved remarkably accurate. Within months of his farewell address, the Kennedy administration increased defense spending dramatically, launching military buildups in Southeast Asia that would consume American resources for the next 15 years. The Bay of Pigs invasion, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and escalation in Vietnam all followed patterns that Eisenhower had predicted. The military-industrial complex grew exactly as Eisenhower had forecast, creating constituencies for perpetual conflict that made peaceful resolution of international disputes politically difficult. Defense contractors became major campaign contributors. Military bases became essential sources of employment in congressional districts, and foreign policy debates became dominated by military rather than diplomatic solutions. Ironically, Eisenhower's warning was regularly cited by peace activists while being completely ignored by policymakers who had the power to act on his recommendations. The speech became a historical artifact rather than a guide to policy. Quoted in academic discussions, while defense spending continued to increase regardless of changing strategic circumstances, the military-industrial complex became so entrenched that questioning its influence was portrayed as unpatriotic. Exactly the outcome Eisenhower had warned against. But military spending wasn't the only area where economic interests were driving American foreign policy. The Cuba sugar quota trap and revolutionary consequences. And speaking of economic interests driving foreign policy decisions with unintended consequences, the American sugar quota system that dominated Cuba's economy before 1960 represents one of the most spectacular examples of how trade policies designed to ensure political control can create exactly the revolutionary conditions they're meant to prevent. The Cuban sugar quota established in the 1930s guaranteed that Cuba could sell a specific amount of sugar to the United States at above-market prices in exchange for political and economic subordination. The arrangement made Cuba the largest sugar supplier to the American market while ensuring that Cuban agriculture remained focused on a single export crop controlled by American companies. The quota system was explicitly designed to create Cuban economic dependency on the United States, making it politically impossible for any Cuban government to adopt policies that Americans opposed. Cuban sugar producers needed access to the American market to survive, giving the United States effective veto power over Cuban domestic and foreign policy decisions. The arrangement worked perfectly for decades, ensuring that Cuban governments remained friendly to American business interests, regardless of their effects on ordinary Cubans. American companies controlled most of Cuba's sugar production, while Cuban politicians competed to maintain favorable relationships with Washington that would protect their access to American markets. The system collapsed in 1960, when the Eisenhower administration canceled Cuba's sugar quota as punishment for Fidel Castro's revolutionary government. The cancellation was intended to force Castro to moderate his policies by demonstrating Cuba's economic dependence on American markets. Instead, the quota cancellation had the opposite effect. It freed Castro from the economic constraints that had limited previous Cuban governments and forced him to seek alternative trading partners. The Soviet Union immediately offered to purchase Cuba's sugar at guaranteed prices, providing the economic foundation for Cuban independence from American influence. The sugar quotas cancellation transformed Castro from a nationalist reformer into a committed opponent of American influence in Latin America. Without the economic leverage that the quota system had provided, the United States lost its most effective tool for controlling Cuban politics. The incident established a pattern of American economic sanctions, backfiring by forcing target countries to develop alternative relationships that reduced rather than increased American influence. But sugar politics weren't the only area where well-intentioned policies created unintended revolutionary consequences. Lincoln's colonization scheme and the alternative to emancipation. Speaking of well-intentioned policies that revealed uncomfortable truths about American racial attitudes, Abraham Lincoln's colonization scheme of 1862 represents one of the most troubling episodes in the great emancipator's presidency. A plan to solve America's slavery problem by shipping freed slaves to Central America rather than integrating them into American society. Lincoln's colonization proposal emerged from his genuine belief that white Americans would never accept racial equality, making voluntary separation the only alternative to perpetual racial conflict. He proposed establishing colonies in Panama or Nicaragua, where formerly enslaved people could create independent societies without competing with white workers for employment or social status. The plan wasn't a fringe idea. It had support from moderate Republicans who wanted to end slavery without addressing its racial implications. Colonization seemed to offer a solution that would satisfy abolitionists who wanted to end human bondage while reassuring white voters who opposed black political participation. Lincoln actively recruited black leaders to support colonization, hosting meetings at the White House where he argued that separation was in everyone's best interest. He told a delegation of black ministers that their presence in America was the fundamental cause of the Civil War, suggesting that voluntary emigration would prevent future racial violence. The response from black leaders was overwhelmingly negative. Frederick Douglass called Lincoln's proposal ridiculous and absurd, while other black spokesmen pointed out that they had built American wealth through centuries of unpaid labor and deserved to share in the society they had helped create. Most practically, the colonization scheme was logistically impossible. Moving 4 million people to Central America would have required massive governmental resources and international cooperation that didn't exist. The few experimental colonies that were established failed quickly due to disease, inadequate supplies, and hostile local conditions. Lincoln quietly abandoned colonization as the war progressed, and he began to see military service by black soldiers as proof of their citizenship claims. But the episode revealed how even the great emancipator initially preferred racial separation to racial integration, demonstrating the limits of white liberal racial attitudes even among slavery's opponents. The colonization scheme showed that ending slavery and accepting racial equality were viewed as separate questions by most 19th century Americans. But 19th century racial attitudes weren't the only uncomfortable truths being hidden from standard historical narratives. The forgotten bonus army and Hoover's military solution. And speaking of uncomfortable truths being hidden from historical narratives, the bonus army eviction of 1932 represents one of the most shameful episodes in American presidential history. A moment when Herbert Hoover used military force against World War I veterans who were peacefully petitioning for benefits they had been legally promised. The bonus army consisted of approximately 17,000 World War I veterans who came to Washington, D.C. in June 1932 to demand immediate payment of bonuses that weren't scheduled to be paid until 1945. The veterans were facing unemployment and homelessness during the Great Depression and needed the money to support their families. The veterans established a camp on the Anacostia Flats across the Potomac River, creating a temporary city complete with kitchens, sanitation facilities, and recreational areas. They maintained military discipline and order, conducting daily flag ceremonies and organizing patrols to prevent crime. Their behavior was exemplary. No major incidents of violence or disorder occurred during their 2-month encampment. Congress initially seemed sympathetic to their demands, with the House of Representatives passing a bill authorizing immediate bonus payments. When the Senate defeated the measure, most veterans accepted defeat and returned home, but about 8,000 remained in Washington, hoping to influence future legislation. Hoover's response was to order military force against American veterans. On July 28, Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur led troops armed with tanks, cavalry, and bayonets against the veteran encampment. The attack included tear gas, burning of temporary shelters, and violent dispersal of peaceful protesters. MacArthur's forces exceeded even Hoover's orders, pursuing fleeing veterans across the Anacostia River and destroying their main camp. 2 veterans were killed, dozens were injured, and hundreds were arrested. The sight of American soldiers attacking American veterans became one of the defining images of Hoover's presidency. Hoover defended the action by calling the veterans an army that threatened public order. But the attack was widely seen as excessive force against citizens exercising constitutional rights. The incident contributed directly to Hoover's landslide defeat in the 1932 election. The bonus army eviction demonstrated how economic crisis could lead to authoritarian responses even in democratic societies, while revealing the limits of official sympathy for military veterans when their demands threatened established priorities. But authoritarian responses to domestic dissent weren't unique to the Great Depression era. Madison's Alien and Sedition Acts and the First War on Free Speech. Speaking of authoritarian responses to domestic dissent, James Madison's role in passing and later opposing the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 represents one of the most instructive examples of how national security concerns can be manipulated to suppress political opposition, and how principled resistance can reverse dangerous precedents before they become permanent features of American governance. The acts were passed during an undeclared naval war with France when Federalist leaders claimed that French agents were operating in the United States, and that domestic critics of government policy were providing aid and comfort to the enemy. The legislation extended residency requirements for naturalization, authorized deportation of dangerous aliens, and criminalized false, scandalous, and malicious criticism of government officials. The Sedition Act was particularly problematic because it essentially made opposition journalism illegal. Republican newspapers that criticized President John Adams or Federalist policies faced prosecution under federal law, while Federalist publications could attack Republicans with impunity. The law was explicitly designed to silence political opposition during the 1800 presidential election. Madison, despite having supported strong federal power during constitutional ratification, recognized that the acts represented exactly the kind of governmental overreach that the Constitution was designed to prevent. Working with Thomas Jefferson, he drafted the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which declared that states could refuse to enforce unconstitutional federal laws. The resistance strategy worked perfectly. The Sedition Act prosecutions backfired politically, making martyrs of Republican editors and demonstrating Federalist willingness to use government power against political opponents. Public opinion turned decisively against the Federalists, contributing to Jefferson's victory in the 1800 election. When Republicans took power, they allowed the Alien and Sedition Acts to expire and pardoned all prisoners convicted under the laws. Jefferson's administration established the precedent that political opposition was legitimate and that peaceful criticism of government was protected speech rather than treasonous activity. The episode demonstrated that authoritarian legislation could be reversed through democratic political action, but only when principled leaders were willing to risk their careers defending constitutional principles, even when those principles protected their political enemies. The Alien and Sedition Acts crisis established free speech as a practical political right rather than just a theoretical constitutional provision. But early American experiments with authoritarian legislation weren't the only area where official narratives obscured the true costs of imperial expansion. The Philippine Insurrection and the Hidden War of Imperial Conquest. And speaking of official narratives that obscured the true costs of government policies, the Philippine-American War of 1899 to 1902 represents one of the most systematically suppressed episodes in American military history. A brutal colonial war that killed over 200,000 civilians while being portrayed in American media as a brief pacification campaign against primitive insurgents. The war began when Filipino independence leaders who had been fighting Spanish colonial rule for years discovered that the Treaty of Paris had transferred the Philippines to American control without consulting the Filipino people. Emilio Aguinaldo's government declared independence and established a democratic constitution, but the McKinley administration refused to recognize Filipino sovereignty. American military strategy in the Philippines resembled tactics that would later be called war crimes: concentration camps for civilian populations, destruction of crops and livestock to starve insurgent areas, torture of prisoners to extract intelligence, and collective punishment of communities suspected of supporting independence fighters. The concentration camp policy was particularly devastating, forcing over 300,000 Filipino civilians into overcrowded camps where disease and malnutrition killed thousands. General J. Franklin Bell's campaigns in Batangas province reduced the population by over one-third through a combination of military action and forced relocation. American media coverage of the war was heavily censored to prevent public awareness of military tactics that contradicted American values of democracy and human rights. War correspondents were required to submit their reports to military censors who removed references to civilian casualties, torture, and other controversial practices. The censorship was so effective that most Americans believed the war had ended within months of its beginning, when fighting actually continued for years. Official casualty figures consistently understated Filipino deaths while emphasizing American losses, creating the impression that the war was less devastating than it actually was. Anti-imperial journalists who attempted to report accurately on military tactics faced prosecution under sedition laws, while soldiers who revealed details about torture or civilian killings were court-martialed for undermining military discipline and national morale. The Philippine War established precedents for media management during military operations that would be repeated in subsequent conflicts, demonstrating how democratic governments could conduct imperial wars while maintaining public support through information control. The war's suppression from popular memory allowed Americans to maintain their self-image as anti-imperial democrats while building a global empire through military conquest. But imperial adventures weren't the only area where American foreign policy created long-term problems. Taft's dollar diplomacy and the militarization of economic policy. Speaking of imperial adventures that created more problems than they solved, William Howard Taft's dollar diplomacy represents one of the earliest examples of how American economic interests could systematically corrupt foreign policy, turning the State Department into a collection agency for private investors and the military into an enforcement mechanism for corporate debt collection. Taft's strategy was elegantly simple: encourage American banks and corporations to invest in Latin American and Caribbean countries, then use diplomatic pressure and military intervention to ensure that those investments remained profitable. The policy was presented as a peaceful alternative to military imperialism, substituting economic influence for direct political control. The strategy required constant military intervention to remain effective. When Central American governments defaulted on loans to American banks or threatened to nationalize American-owned properties, Taft dispatched Marines to protect American economic interests. Between 1909 and 1921, American forces occupied Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Honduras to enforce debt payments and protect corporate investments. The interventions created exactly the instability they were designed to prevent. Military occupations provoked nationalist resistance movements that made American investments less secure rather than more secure. Local governments that cooperated with American demands lost legitimacy with their own populations, while those that resisted faced military intervention. Dollar diplomacy transformed legitimate business disputes into questions of national honor, making it impossible to resolve commercial conflicts through normal diplomatic channels. Every defaulted loan became a potential cause for military intervention, while every act of resistance to American economic demands was portrayed as a threat to American security. The policy was particularly destructive in Nicaragua, where American intervention in 1912 led to decades of political instability and eventually produced the Sandinista Revolution of 1979. American efforts to control Nicaraguan finances through military occupation created long-term anti-American sentiment that outlasted any economic benefits from the original investments. Taft's dollar diplomacy established patterns of American foreign policy that persisted throughout the 20th century. The assumption that American economic interests were equivalent to American national interests and the willingness to use military force to protect private investment regardless of the effects on local populations. The policy demonstrated how economic imperialism could be more destabilizing than political imperialism, creating cycles of intervention and resistance that lasted for generations. Wilson's Creel Committee and the birth of government propaganda. But economic imperialism wasn't the only area where American institutions were learning to manipulate public opinion through systematic deception. Woodrow Wilson's Committee on Public Information, established in 1917 under George Creel's leadership, represents the first systematic government propaganda operation in American history. A massive media manipulation campaign that transformed American journalism from independent reporting into state-sponsored persuasion. The Creel Committee was created to build public support for American entry into World War I, a conflict that most Americans had wanted to avoid. Wilson faced the challenge of mobilizing a reluctant population for a European war that seemed to have little connection to American interests or security. Creel's solution was to flood American media with coordinated messaging that portrayed the war as a crusade for democracy against German barbarism. The committee produced over 75 million pamphlets, recruited 75,000 volunteer speakers called 4-Minute Men, who gave patriotic speeches at public events, and worked directly with newspapers to ensure favorable coverage of administration policies. The operation went far beyond traditional government communication. Creel's team created fake atrocity stories about German soldiers, manipulated photographs to show German brutality, and censored news reports that might undermine public enthusiasm for the war. They essentially turned American journalism into an extension of government policy rather than an independent check on governmental power. The propaganda was extraordinarily effective, transforming American public opinion from isolationist to interventionist within months. But when the war ended and many of Creel's stories were exposed as fabrications, the backlash created widespread cynicism about government credibility that persisted through the 1920s and 30s. The Creel Committee established the template for modern government public relations, demonstrating how democratic governments could manipulate public opinion as effectively as authoritarian regimes. And speaking of systematic manipulation of public opinion to obscure government failures, the lost Scottsboro Boys and justice delayed. Speaking of systematic manipulation designed to obscure uncomfortable truths, the Scottsboro Boys case of 1931 represents one of the most instructive examples of how legal victories could be systematically erased from public memory when they challenged established racial hierarchies despite producing landmark Supreme Court decisions that revolutionized American criminal justice. 9 black teenagers were accused of raping 2 white women on a freight train in Alabama, leading to trials that were so obviously biased that they became international symbols of American racial injustice. The defendants were tried before all-white juries, denied adequate legal representation, and sentenced to death based on testimony that was later revealed to be perjured. The case produced 2 crucial Supreme Court victories. Powell v. Alabama established the right to adequate legal counsel in capital cases, while Norris v. Alabama prohibited the systematic exclusion of African Americans from jury service. These decisions fundamentally changed American criminal procedure, establishing constitutional protections that benefited all defendants regardless of race. The legal victories should have made the Scottsboro Boys heroes of civil rights progress. But instead, their story was gradually removed from mainstream historical narratives. Textbook publishers found the case too controversial for inclusion in standard curricula, while civil rights organizations focused on more recent victories that didn't require discussion of systematic perjury and judicial corruption. The international attention that the case generated was particularly embarrassing to American officials, who were trying to portray the United States as a beacon of democracy during the Great Depression. The Soviet Union and other critics of American democracy used the Scottsboro trials as evidence that American justice was fundamentally racist and corrupt. By the 1950s, most Americans had forgotten about the Scottsboro Boys despite their landmark legal victories, demonstrating how even successful challenges to racial injustice could be erased from popular memory when they revealed uncomfortable truths about American institutions. But legal victories weren't the only wartime achievements being systematically hidden from public view. FDR's Executive Order 9066 and the forced labor loophole. And speaking of wartime achievements being hidden from public view, Franklin Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066, which authorized Japanese-American internment, contained a little-discussed provision that transformed relocation centers into forced labor camps that generated millions of dollars in profits for the federal government while families lost their homes, businesses, and life savings. The order authorized the removal of over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. But the detention wasn't simply punitive. It was designed to extract economic value from imprisoned populations. Internees were required to perform agricultural labor, manufacturing work, and construction projects at wages far below market rates. The War Relocation Authority operated internment camps as profitable enterprises, selling agricultural products grown by detained families to external markets while paying internees between $12 and $19 per month for full-time labor. Camp administrators purchased farm equipment and seeds with government funds, then used unpaid Japanese-American labor to generate revenue that offset detention costs. Most devastatingly, the government systematically seized and sold Japanese-American property while families were detained. Real estate, businesses, automobiles, and personal possessions were liquidated through government auctions with proceeds used to fund camp operations rather than being held for eventual return to owners. The property seizures were legalized through emergency wartime regulations that suspended normal due process protections, allowing government agents to confiscate assets without compensation or judicial review. Families lost homes worth thousands of dollars that were sold for hundreds, while businesses built over generations were liquidated for a fraction of their value. When internment ended in 1945, most families returned to communities where their former property was owned by others and their economic foundations had been destroyed. The government's reparations payments in the 1980s provided token compensation that represented a small fraction of actual losses. Executive Order 9066 demonstrated how wartime emergency powers could be used to transfer wealth from targeted populations to government coffers while being portrayed as necessary security measures. But wartime property seizures weren't the only area where Allied victory involved morally questionable operations. Truman's Operation Keelhaul and the betrayal of Soviet prisoners. Speaking of morally questionable wartime operations that were hidden from public scrutiny, Harry Truman's continuation of Operation Keelhaul represents one of the most shameful episodes in Allied victory. The forced repatriation of over 2 million Soviet prisoners of war and displaced persons to Stalin's Soviet Union, where most faced execution or imprisonment in gulags. The operation began during the Yalta Conference, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin agreed that all displaced persons would be returned to their countries of origin regardless of their wishes. The agreement seemed reasonable in principle, but it ignored the reality that millions of Soviet citizens had legitimate reasons to fear returning to Stalin's regime. Many Soviet prisoners of war had been captured early in the war and spent years in German camps where they were exposed to anti-Soviet propaganda or forced to work for German military units. Under Stalin's interpretation of Soviet law, capture itself was evidence of treason, making returned prisoners subject to execution or 25-year gulag sentences. Allied forces were ordered to use whatever force was necessary to compel repatriation, including physical violence against prisoners who resisted return. British and American soldiers found themselves in the position of forcing anti-communist refugees into Soviet custody at bayonet point, knowing that many would face execution upon arrival. The most notorious incident occurred at Judenburg, Austria, where British forces used deception to load Soviet refugees onto trains, telling them they were being relocated to safety when they were actually being delivered to Soviet authorities. Families committed suicide rather than face repatriation, while others were beaten unconscious and loaded onto cattle cars. Eisenhower and other Allied commanders recognized that Operation Keelhaul violated basic humanitarian principles, but they continued the policy to maintain Allied unity during the final phases of the war. The operation continued until 1947, well after wartime justifications had expired. The forced repatriations remained classified for decades, preventing public discussion of how Allied victory had required the sacrifice of millions of innocent people to preserve the wartime alliance with Stalin. But Cold War alliance management wasn't the only area where covert operations were producing unintended consequences. Kennedy's Operation Mongoose and the explosive seashell incident. And speaking of covert operations producing unintended consequences, John Kennedy's Operation Mongoose represents the moment American intelligence agencies crossed the line from serious espionage into absurd cartoon villainy, authorizing over 300 assassination attempts against Fidel Castro that included exploding seashells, poison-line diving suits, and LSD-laced beard treatments that sound more like coyote schemes than professional intelligence operations. Mongoose was established in 1962 as a comprehensive program to destabilize Castro's government through sabotage, propaganda, and assassination. The operation was run directly from the White House, with Robert Kennedy personally supervising plans that ranged from economic warfare to increasingly bizarre murder plots. The CIA's Technical Services Division developed assassination devices that revealed a profound disconnect from reality. A diving suit treated with toxic chemicals for Castro's well-known scuba diving hobby. A fountain pen that would inject deadly poison during autograph signings. And a cigar box rigged with explosives for his legendary smoking habit. The most ridiculous plot involved contaminating Castro's beard with thallium salts that would cause his hair to fall out, supposedly undermining his charismatic authority by making him appear weak and unhealthy. CIA operatives actually obtained access to Castro's hotel room during a diplomatic trip, but couldn't figure out how to apply the chemicals without detection. The exploding seashell plot represented the pinnacle of intelligence agency absurdity. CIA divers planned to plant an attractive conch shell filled with explosives near Castro's favorite diving spot, assuming he would be unable to resist collecting the specimen. The plan was abandoned when agents realized they couldn't predict Castro's diving schedule accurately enough to ensure he would find the shell. These operations weren't just failures. They were counterproductive, convincing Castro that the United States was committed to his assassination and justifying increasingly repressive domestic policies as necessary self-defense measures. When Operation Mongoose files were declassified decades later, even CIA officials expressed embarrassment at the juvenile nature of plots that had consumed millions of dollars and hundreds of personnel hours. But assassination plots weren't the only area where Cold War paranoia was producing systematic violations of civil liberties. Nixon's enemies list and the weaponization of government. Speaking of Cold War paranoia producing systematic violations of civil liberties, Richard Nixon's enemies list represents the most comprehensive attempt by any American president to weaponize federal agencies against political opponents. A systematic abuse of power that targeted over 20,000 Americans for harassment through tax audits, FBI surveillance, and administrative persecution. The list began as an informal White House compilation of journalists, politicians, and activists who criticized Nixon's policies, but it evolved into a systematic program to use government agencies as tools of political warfare. The Internal Revenue Service, Federal Bureau of Investigation, and other agencies were directed to target list members for intensive scrutiny designed to punish opposition rather than enforce laws. Charles Colson, Nixon's special counsel, explicitly described the strategy in memos that became public during Watergate investigations. Use the available federal machinery to screw our political enemies. The approach was comprehensive, targeting critics through tax investigations, federal contract cancellations, regulatory harassment, and criminal investigations based on political rather than legal criteria. Prominent journalists like Daniel Shore and Mary McGrory found themselves subject to FBI background investigations disguised as security clearance checks, while anti-war activists faced IRS audits that consumed years of their time and thousands of dollars in legal fees. The harassment was designed to discourage criticism by making opposition to Nixon personally costly. The enemies list revealed how presidential power could be systematically abused when normal oversight mechanisms failed. Congressional Democrats were unaware of the program's scope until Watergate investigations exposed internal White House documents demonstrating how executive agencies could be corrupted without legislative knowledge. Nixon's enemies list established precedents for political weaponization of government that influenced subsequent administrations, showing how easily democratic institutions could be turned against citizens who exercised constitutional rights to criticize government policies. The list's exposure during Watergate became one of the key factors in Nixon's resignation, proving that systematic abuse of government power could still trigger constitutional accountability mechanisms when properly investigated. But Nixon's abuses of executive power weren't the only area where presidential misconduct was being covered up. Ford's Halloween Massacre and the Saturday Night sequel. And speaking of presidential misconduct being systematically covered up, Gerald Ford's Halloween Massacre of 1975 represents one of the most brazen attempts by any president to obstruct ongoing congressional investigations. A wholesale firing of intelligence officials and cabinet members designed to prevent further revelations about CIA and FBI abuses that were embarrassing the Ford administration. The massacre occurred on November 2, 1975, when Ford simultaneously fired CIA Director William Colby, Defense Secretary James Schlesinger, and moved Henry Kissinger from his dual role as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor to Secretary of State only. The reorganization was portrayed as routine personnel management, but it was actually designed to stop congressional investigations into intelligence community abuses. Colby had been cooperating extensively with congressional committees investigating CIA domestic surveillance, assassination plots, and other illegal activities. His testimony was revealing decades of agency misconduct that violated federal law and constitutional principles, creating political problems for Ford's 1976 presidential campaign. Schlesinger had been similarly forthcoming about Defense Department intelligence operations, providing Congress with detailed information about military surveillance of American citizens and cooperation with CIA domestic programs. Both officials were considered too willing to expose government wrongdoing for political comfort. Ford's solution was to replace them with officials who would be less cooperative with congressional oversight. George H.W. Bush became CIA director with explicit instructions to limit agency cooperation with investigators, while Donald Rumsfeld replaced Schlesinger and immediately began restricting Defense Department responsiveness to congressional requests. The reorganization was timed to occur during congressional recess, preventing immediate legislative response and allowing the new officials to establish restrictive policies before Congress returned to Washington. The strategy succeeded in limiting further revelations about intelligence community abuses. Ford's Halloween massacre demonstrated how presidents could use personnel changes to obstruct congressional oversight, establishing precedents for executive resistance to legislative investigations that influenced subsequent constitutional confrontations between the branches of government. The incident revealed the limits of congressional investigative power when presidents were willing to sacrifice competent officials to protect institutional secrets. But executive obstruction of congressional oversight wasn't the only area where Cold War weapons policies were creating dangerous precedents. Carter's neutron bomb hesitation and the logic of limited nuclear war. Speaking of Cold War weapons policies creating dangerous precedents, Jimmy Carter's decision to delay neutron bomb deployment in 1977 represents one of the most consequential nuclear weapons decisions in American history. A choice that was portrayed as weakness by political opponents, but actually prevented the normalization of tactical nuclear weapons that could have made nuclear war more likely rather than less likely. The neutron bomb was designed as a clean nuclear weapon that would kill people through intense radiation while causing minimal damage to buildings and infrastructure. Military planners argued that enhanced radiation warheads would be ideal for defending Western Europe against Soviet tank attacks, allowing NATO forces to stop Soviet advances without destroying the cities they were defending. The weapon's appeal was its apparent precision. It could eliminate enemy personnel while preserving physical infrastructure, making nuclear weapons seem more usable in limited conflicts. Proponents argued that neutron bombs would actually reduce the likelihood of nuclear war by providing alternatives to city-destroying strategic weapons. Carter recognized that this logic was fundamentally flawed. Creating more usable nuclear weapons would lower the threshold for nuclear conflict rather than raising it, making nuclear war more likely by providing military commanders with weapons they might actually be willing to deploy. The neutron bomb's cleaner image could make nuclear weapons politically acceptable in conflicts where traditional nuclear weapons would be unthinkable. European allies were deeply divided about neutron bomb deployment, with many viewing the weapons as evidence that Americans were willing to fight nuclear war on European soil while protecting American territory. The controversy threatened NATO unity at a time when alliance solidarity was essential to containing Soviet influence. Carter's delay prevented neutron bomb deployment until the Reagan administration, when changing strategic circumstances made the weapons less relevant to European defense planning. The delay demonstrated how presidential restraint could prevent dangerous precedents in nuclear weapons policy. The neutron bomb controversy revealed how technical advances in weapons design could create political pressures for more aggressive military policies unless civilian leaders maintained firm control over strategic planning. But nuclear weapons restraint wasn't the only area where Reagan administration policies differed dramatically from their public presentation. Reagan's Star Wars bluff and the $30 billion gamble. And speaking of Reagan administration policies that differed dramatically from their public presentation, the Strategic Defense Initiative of 1983 represents one of the most successful propaganda operations in American history. A missile defense program that was never intended to work but convinced the Soviet Union to bankrupt itself, trying to counter imaginary American technological advances. Reagan's Star Wars program was announced with great fanfare as a comprehensive missile defense system that would make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete by destroying incoming missiles before they could reach American targets. The technology was portrayed as nearly perfected, requiring only adequate funding and political commitment to deploy effective nationwide protection. The reality was that SDI was technologically impossible with available technology and would remain impossible for decades. American scientists understood that the basic physics of intercepting thousands of incoming warheads was insurmountable. While the computer systems required to coordinate such defenses exceeded any conceivable processing capabilities. Reagan's advisors explicitly discussed SDI as a bluff designed to force Soviet military spending increases that would strain their economy beyond its capacity to compete with American technology. Internal memos revealed that the program was intended to spend the Soviets into the ground, rather than actually develop functional missile defenses. The strategy worked perfectly. Soviet leaders took SDI seriously and redirected massive resources toward developing countermeasures and competing technologies, contributing to economic pressures that helped bring down the Soviet system. They spent billions trying to counter American advances that didn't actually exist. Meanwhile, the United States spent over $30 billion on research projects that were never intended to produce deployable weapons, money that could have been used for education, infrastructure, or other domestic priorities. The program became a massive transfer of resources from taxpayers to defense contractors. SDI's success as a propaganda operation masked its failure as a technology program, demonstrating how strategic deception could achieve foreign policy objectives that conventional military programs couldn't accomplish. The program revealed how Cold War competition had become more about perception than reality, with both sides spending vast sums on projects designed to impress opponents rather than serve practical military purposes. But Cold War deception tactics weren't the only area where intelligence failures were creating lasting foreign policy disasters. Bush's WMD curveball and the fabricated case for war. Speaking of intelligence failures creating lasting foreign policy disasters, the curveball intelligence operation that justified the 2003 invasion of Iraq represents the most spectacular example of how fabricated evidence could be transformed into national security policy when it supported predetermined political objectives. A deception so obvious that it was exposed as false before the invasion began, but was ignored by policymakers committed to regime change. Curveball was the code name for Rafid Ahmed Alwan al-Janabi, an Iraqi defector who claimed to have worked in Saddam Hussein's biological weapons program and provided detailed descriptions of mobile weapons laboratories that supposedly produced anthrax and other biological agents for military use. German intelligence officers who debriefed Curveball reported that his information was unreliable and that he was probably fabricating stories to gain asylum and financial support. They warned American intelligence agencies that Curveball was an alcoholic with serious credibility problems who had never actually worked in biological weapons production. These warnings were systematically ignored by American intelligence analysts who needed evidence to support the Bush administration's claims about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. Curveball's fabricated stories became central to Colin Powell's presentation to the United Nations, where computer-generated images of mobile weapons labs were presented as verified intelligence. The deception was so complete that Powell later called his UN presentation a blot on his record, acknowledging that he had unknowingly presented false information as fact. But the false intelligence had already achieved its purpose, building public support for invasion by creating the impression that Saddam possessed dangerous weapons. After the invasion, extensive searches found no evidence of biological weapons production or mobile laboratories matching Curveball's descriptions. Curveball himself eventually admitted that he had fabricated his entire story to encourage American intervention against Saddam's regime. The incident revealed how intelligence agencies could be pressured to provide evidence supporting predetermined political conclusions rather than objective assessments of actual threats, demonstrating the dangers of politicizing intelligence analysis. And there you have it. 50 forbidden chapters in the American story that somehow got left out of the official version. From Standing Bear's fight to be recognized as human to Bush's phantom weapons of mass destruction, we've traced a pattern of power protecting itself through selective memory and convenient amnesia. The beautiful irony is that these hidden stories are often more inspiring than the myths that replace them. Real people making impossible choices, fighting systems designed to crush them. Standing Bear going to court to prove he was human in federal court. Sweet dreams, and remember, the truth is always stranger than the textbook.